Let's discuss troubleshooting other common desktop symptoms. One important one you'll see on the exam and in the field is overheating. Why will a computer overheat? There's several reasons for this, but the most common is an airflow problem. And when we built the AV editor computer, we talked about airflow. We said you want to have good airflow going through the system. Air should be pulled in from the front and blown out the back or the sides or top. Generally the back though. And so you want to have those fans working and make sure that you have good airflow through the system and make sure that all the cables are managed properly so that you have enough space to move the air. You want to make sure all those fans are working, including the CPU fan. Now, if the CPU runs too hot or it doesn't have enough room to discharge its heat, then the system could overheat and it could shut down. It could have intermittent issues. It could freeze. A lot of things could happen. So you want to have the proper heat sink for the CPU. And you remember we put a huge heat sink on AV Editor. And you may want to look into liquid cooling for the CPU. Also, you want to look at the RAM and consider heat sinks for the RAM as well. Then you want to check the power supply capacity. If the power supply doesn't have enough power, that could actually overheat. And the rails could overheat. You could have more issues. So you always want to have more power than necessary for your system. And then check if the CPU isn't being taxed too much. And you could do that in the task manager, or you could use CPU-Z to analyze the CPU, see what percentage is being used. You could also use the performance monitor and set alerts to tell you if the CPU has gone over a specific percentage for a specific amount of time. So try checking all that. So that's a little bit about overheating. Next is loud noise. Yeah, you don't want your PC to be making a loud noise. Loud noises could occur due to something brushing against the fan. So you want to check your cable management. Make sure there's no cables brushing up against the fan. And also make sure that the fans aren't too dirty. If they get dirty, they can really make a lot of noise. So you could remove those and use compressed air, blow those out outside and get all the dust bunnies out of there. Now, another possibility for loud noise is the hard drive. If you have a magnetic disk, if that starts making loud noises, you want to be real careful with that. You're going to want to back up the data as soon as possible, first of all, and then you're going to want to check out that drive. Chances are there's a physical problem with that drive. So you're going to want to check out that and probably replace it after you do the backup. Now, older SCSI drives make a good amount of noise. Newer ones, for example, serial attached SCSI, are not that noisy. So you really want to check that stuff carefully and know which drive you're dealing with. But if it's an older SCSI drive or a SATA drive today that's a magnetic disk, not solid state, that magnetic disk may make noise as it gets damaged, as it gets older. The solid state drives aren't going to make any noise. So watch out for loud noises. Intermittent device failure. This is the toughest thing to troubleshoot. You know, your power supply might intermittently fail, and we mentioned that that could be because it's not powerful enough. Or your connections may be sort of loose. You're going to want to disconnect and reconnect them, or they could be dirty. You want to make sure the CPU has no dust. You want to make sure the RAM connections are clean, no dust bunnies in there anywhere. Same thing with the video card. But check that you have the power capacity. Make sure your power supply is powerful enough to power all your devices. And again, check those connections and check for dust and dirt. Indicator lights. You know, sometimes you'll get an indicator light that'll tell you that there's a problem. You might have an indicator light on the front of the PC, or you might have one on the motherboard. For example, if your RAM fails on a motherboard, you might have a little indicator light for that, in addition to a beep code. And on the motherboard we used on the AV editor, you also have that post code, which we'll show later on. So watch for indicator lights. If you see red lights especially, check those in your documentation for your motherboard or just your computer model number and see if that can help you out a little bit. In addition, you'll have a hard drive light. The HDD LED, that can tell you a lot of things as well. If you see that really blinking a lot and you're not doing anything on the system, then maybe you want to check that also. Smoke or burning smell. Previously, we said that you're going to use a lot of tools when troubleshooting a computer. But the best tools, we said, are your eyes and your ears. Let's add to that your nose. If you ever smell something burning from a computer, or if you see smoke, you're going to want to turn it off and disconnect it right away. So if you see any type of smoke, or if you smell anything that is type of a burning smell or a strange odor coming from the power supply, you want to turn it off and disconnect it immediately. Usually smoke or a burning smell is going to be coming from the power supply, and that means it's about to fail. You're not going to have much time with this, so you got to act quickly and get rid of that power supply. Just recycle it. You're not going to want to do anything with that power supply again. Swap it out with something good. Now, it's possible that you could have a burning smell or smoke for other reasons. For example, if one of your rails coming from the power supply is overheating because the components it's powering are pulling too much power. So you want to use a multi-rail system and make sure that you're not using too much power for a power supply that can't provide what you need. You want to make sure the capacity of the power supply is good enough for your needs. Now, sometimes the fan will fail on the power supply. That's a possibility as well. And it's possible that the CPU could overheat and cause a burning smell as well. That's when it's too late for the CPU, most likely that'll have to be replaced. But generally, it's a power supply issue. So you want to really replace that if you ever see any smoke or smell any burning types of odors. Some power supplies have a burn-in period of about 24 to 48 hours where there is a slight odor. That's a little bit different, and that may be normal. Now, if you have a system you're working on, you'll probably just want to run that in the lab until that odor goes away. Make sure that it is a burn-in. But, if something goes wrong, it's usually going to be much more potent than that burn-in period smell. So keep that in mind. And finally, distended capacitors. This is when a capacitor bursts. And this happens sometimes with motherboards and with gaming consoles and video cards and in power supplies and yada, yada, yada. Now, if this happens in a power supply, you're not going to really see it. The power supply is probably just going to fail. So you just replace it. I don't recommend opening the power supply because it does hold a charge. And for the A+, they don't want you to do that either. But for other devices like motherboards, you can swap out the capacitors. And this was a big problem in the first decade of the new millennium. Basically between 2000 and 2010, there were a lot of devices that were manufactured with bad capacitors. And the capacitors failed, and they called it the capacitor plague. And it was an electrolytic issue which caused the capacitor to burst, basically. Usually, they wouldn't just explode, they would just kind of crack. So your motherboard might still be okay, and you just have to replace the capacitors. And I say that's a big deal because you have to be able to solder very well. If you're not good at soldering, you probably want to just replace the motherboard. And in most cases, for the companies I've worked with, that's what they do. They don't spend the time resoldering components onto a motherboard. They'll just put a new board in. But it is possible to resolder a new capacitor onto the board. You'll have to remove the old capacitor, and you have to do that with a very hot soldering iron. And then you'll have to use actual solder wire to attach a new one. Now, soldering is an art. If you're not sure about this, that's the kind of thing you want to take to a pro, or again, just replace the board if it's not too expensive. Now, there's lots of places to learn more about soldering. The A+ exam doesn't really get into that depth of PC repair, but if you want to learn more about soldering, there's a lot of good articles on the internet, for example, at masterappliance.com, a whole thing about soldering circuit boards, what you need, and how to do it step by step. And specifically for capacitors, look at capacitorlab.com. There is an entire how-to on how to deal with capacitors on system boards and how to replace those. One of the keys is you need a really good soldering iron, and it's got to be really, really hot in order to work properly, in order to remove the capacitor and also to solder a new one back on. So you want to be real careful with that. Also, you need to make sure that you're using lead-free solder, because most companies and organizations will deal with the ROHS or ROHS initiative, which means no lead. And in addition to that, you only use a tiny bit of solder. The tiniest bit goes the longest way. And another tip I can share with you from soldering in the past, the solder should actually get attracted to the heat. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So distended capacitors, that basically means they burst. And if you see that they leaked on the board, really the board's got to go, unfortunately. But generally that doesn't happen. Usually they just kind of crack at the top. The little crosshairs at the top will crack, and then they don't work anymore. And they have to either be replaced or replace the board. So there's a little bit of troubleshooting other common desktop symptoms. You want to be real careful with a lot of these. Smoke or burning smell or overheating could be a fire hazard. So not only do you want to, shut down the computer, disconnect it, but also you want to have a fire extinguisher handy. An ABC fire extinguisher should always be in your lab. And, you want to be ready to, put out any fires if they do start. Call the fire department if necessary. And you want to make sure that your sprinkler system in your organization is working properly. That should be tested every 6 months or so. So there's a little bit about other common desktop symptoms, and that's it for this sub lesson.